Okay, thank you very much, Elsa. We're very much enjoying our time here at University of Vigo, and we're very happy that we now have an agreement signed between the two universities, or will be signed on Monday, that will allow us to proceed with collaborations for the next several years, we hope. So we have been working on biogeography and climate for the last, really since 2004, looking at distribution of species on the European coast, trying to understand the link between climate and geographic distribution of species. And one of the events that happened during that time was an extreme winter. There's been long-term warming of the planet since the 1800s, in fact even earlier, but periodically there are extreme events. In 1963 there was a very extreme event, which was well documented. This is a graph of the temperature anomalies in the period from 1950 to 2010, and you can see that there's very, very cold period in here that's 1963. And in 63, there were catastrophic die-offs of many species. There were in the English intertidal, there were catastrophic die-offs of a whole range of species, and the result of that winter was so catastrophic that it took some species as long as 40 years to return to their previous geographic distribution. So here we have a map of the 1963 sea surface temperature in February, derived from ECOWAD's data, and here we have the 2010 February SST derived from MODIS. And you can see that the 10-degree isotherm in 1963 was south of Arcachon in France, and in 2010 the 10-degree isotherm was in a very similar position. In fact, the distribution of temperatures looks very similar between those 2 years. As a result of this, we decided that it would be very important to look at the response of European intertidal to this very cold winter, because it was an extreme event that occurred against a background of long-term warming. And contrary to 1963, the winter of 2009-10 was preceded and followed by a very warm summer. So unlike the 63 period where there were cold summers before and after, in 2010 there were very warm summers. So we're looking at two kinds of species. We're looking at northern species and southern species. The example of the northern species that we are working on is the barnacle Semibalanus balanoides. It suffers reproductive failure in warm winters. And it also suffers mortality in hot summers. The reproductive failure is quite striking. If the temperature in the winter is above 10 degrees Celsius for more than, if you have at least a month below 10 degrees Celsius, then the species will reproduce. If you have less than that, then the species fails. And this is the result of experiments by Dennis Crisp, as well as Harold Barnes, and also field data from the French investigator Luc Treves. So we have a threshold of response. Warm winter, this species fails to reproduce. Cold winters, it does reproduce. Their southern species, in contrast, that we are looking at is the polychaete Diopatra. It appears to have reproductive failure in cold summers. So, and it probably has mortality in cold winters. So it has, in some ways, an opposite response to the northern species. So we've been looking at their distribution. So to remind you of what they look like, Semibalanus, the Diopatra makes tubes on the surface of the sand flats, decorated with algae and shell. This is what the front of Diopatra looks like. It is quite common in the estuaries around here. It is harvested at the Confraria de Renodela. And then Semibalanus, there's a familiar North Atlantic barnacle. This is what it looks like close up. And in the northern Atlantic, it is the dominant species. Here we are near its southern limit. So we've looked We did a survey in 2005 and 6 and looked at the distribution of the species, both of these species, and we then looked at the history of the distribution of those species. On the left, I have the Semibalanus pattern. In 1872, it was recorded from Biarritz by Paul Fisher. In 1955, its southern limit was described as the mouth of the Gironde. By 1963, it was found in Arcachon, and it was still there in the early 1970s. Then we found its southern limit here. It was absent south of this region, but we found it here in 2006. So during the period from 1872 to 2006, it had moved north, then south, then north. At the same time, in the 1860s and 1890s, the northern limit of Diopatra, which ran all the way to the Mediterranean, its northern limit was Arcachon. Then in 1969 and 66, it was found north of the Gironde. Then by 1976, Glemarec found it even a bit farther north, and we found its northern limit to be near Quiberon in 2006. So at the same time that Semibalanus had been retreating to the north, Diopatra had been expanding to the north. And what's interesting is their distributions overlapped by 100 kilometers in the 1880s, and they overlapped by about 100 kilometers in 2006. It's just the overlap zone had moved. So looking at the distribution of winters and the distribution of Semibalanus, here I've plotted the number of winters since 1951 that had February SST less than 10 degrees Celsius. So the cold regions in dark blue had many winters colder than 10 degrees Celsius, and in the south, very few winters. And Semibalanus is in the region, is found everywhere in the north, and its southern distribution on the French coast is in this region that has some winters colder than 10 degrees Celsius. And then it is in Galicia, and this temperature distribution here is one that is very coarse geographic scale, so it does not resolve the colder temperatures in the Rias. So we'll look in a little more detail at what's going on in the Rias. If we look at the last 10 years in the Rias in Galicia, here I've plotted the fraction of years between 2002 and 2011 in which the temperature in February, the average temperature in February was below 10 degrees Celsius, according to the MODIS satellite imagery from NASA. And what you see is that the Rio de Arosa has some winters that were cold. The region around Chthamalus has some winters that were cold enough, and the Rio de Vigo has a little bit of winters that were cold enough. If we then look at the distribution data that we have collected in 2011, we found Semibalanus in Viana do Castelo in Portugal. We found it in Bayona. We found it in the Rio de Vigo. We found it here. We found it in the Rio de Arosa, very abundant there. And then at Porto Sin and at Muros and at Chthamalus, and then in the Camariñas estuary. But then we did not find it in Sada or Cedeira or Ortigueira. So the region where you find the most Semibalanus is also the region where we have the most permissive winters, based on MODIS satellite imagery. So let's look at the history of the change. Here we have the distribution in northwest Iberia, the distribution in the Bay of Biscay, and the distribution in the English Channel. These data are from Dennis Crisp and from Fisher-Piet. And in the 1950s, it was cold. This species was the size of the symbols. The largest symbols mean the species was abundant, then common, frequent, occasional, very rare, or the open symbol means missing. So the species was present throughout the English Channel. It was less common in the southern Bay of Biscay. Here's the mouth of the Gironde. Here is Arcachon. So in the 1950s, its southern limit was around Rayon. And then in Galicia, it was found in the Rio de Vigo and then in northern Portugal. but only once in northern Portugal. It was found in one year, 1957. In February, there were abundant in Viana do Castelo, and by August, they were all gone. And that's the only record for Viana do Castelo. In 1963, it was colder. The survey was less broad, but the species occupied the western English Channel. It was more abundant in the southern Biscay. It was found at Arcachon, and its southern limit was Bayona. By 2007, it was much warmer, and the species was present in the English Channel to the east, but it was completely missing in the western English Channel. Its southern limit in the Bay of Biscay was, where we were able to find it, was at Les Sables d'Olonne, and absent in this whole region. And in Galicia, the southernmost population we found was in the Rio de Vigo. By 2010, it had expanded in the English Channel. This region, which had been absent in 2007, had been filled in, so there were populations everywhere in this region. The southernmost Semibalanus we found were at Châtillon-Plage, further south on the French coast. They were more abundant at Les Sables d'Olonne than before, and we found them in Viana do Castelo. And then in 2011, the pattern was retained. But we found them also in Arcachon. We found them also at Verdun, at the Pointe de Grave, at the mouth of the Gironde, and they were still in Viana do Castelo. This year, they are still alive in Viana do Castelo. We found 4 adults and 1 recruit. We assume the 1 recruit came from Bayona because there's not an adult population. So, this is a northern species, enhanced reproduction in cold winters. The effect of the extreme winter was it expanded by 80 kilometers on the coast of Spain and Portugal since 2006 with multi-year survival in Viana do Castelo. It expanded by 150 to 200 kilometers on the west coast of France since 2006, and it's reported from Arcachon now for the first time since the 1970s. And it filled in a 130 kilometer gap in the English Channel since 2007. So big expansion of this species after these cold winters, when presumably there was large amount of reproduction. Now, Diopatra. Diopatra appears to be limited by cold summers. So here the diagram shows the distribution of summers since 1951 warmer than 18 degrees Celsius. In the north, there are very few. In the south, there are many. And the distribution of the species is quite interesting. Its northern limit in 2010 was here. It's found all along the coast until we get to Bayona. Then it disappears. And then it reappears again in Aveiro, and it's common all the way into the Mediterranean. So it has a gap in distribution here in the upwelling zone of Portugal, where there's summer upwelling, and it has its northern limit here where the water gets much colder. So our inference from this distribution pattern is that the summer cold temperatures are the problem for Diopatra. If we now look at the changes in this species since 2006 to 2011, in 2006, there was the gap in the distribution in northwest Iberia, present in Bayona, missing in all of these sites, and then reappears in Aveiro. The same distribution pattern in 2010, the same distribution pattern in 2011. So the cold winter did not change that distribution. On the French coast, northern limit was near Quiberon in 2006. It was still in that very small region, same region in 2010 and same in 2011. The difference, the one odd thing that's going on is that right here in the corner of Mont Saint-Michel Bay, there is an isolated population which was presumably brought by fishermen, and it has adults but does not have young individuals. And it reproduced sometime, but we're not sure when. And, but it is one isolated set of populations right here in the corner of Bay of Mont Saint-Michel. So this southern genus has been moving north since the 1880s. It has a distribution gap in Portugal, and its population success seems to be associated with warm summers. And it has relatively stable distribution since 2006 during the period of warm summers. So the extreme winter did not seem to make dramatic changes in this species, whereas the extreme winter had a big effect on the northern species. So we've now done some biogeographic modeling. We've built age-structured metapopulation models controlled by sea surface temperature using gridded ecoads temperatures from 1850 to the present. We assume dispersal based on either nearest neighbor dispersal, 10 to 20 kilometers per year dispersal of larvae, or now for recent times we're working with ocean models to estimate that. So we seed the entire coast with the species in 1850 and then see what happens. Every year there's a new climate. Every year there's some dispersal. Every year each location either reproduces or not. What we get is a pattern like this. This is time on this axis and geographic position along the coast along this axis. This tick mark here is Biarritz. This tick mark here is Brest. So Semibalanus, the model says the southern geographic limit should have done this during the time between 1850 and 2010. The dots are the observed southern limits. So the pattern of change in the geographic limit observed in historical records is very similar to what our model says should have happened. We made a similar model for the barnacle Chthamalus, and it shows something similar, moving somewhat north, south, north along with climate. Diopatra is a broader distribution. This tick mark is in I think Cadiz. This one is something like Aveiro. This one is Biarritz, and this one is Brest. The model says the geographic limit should have expanded, contracted, and expanded. And except for the 1860 southern limit in Arcachon, the model follows the distribution pattern very well. And the model says there should be a gap in central Portugal, and we do indeed find a gap there. For Aranicola, our model suggests that the southern limit in Portugal should have been moving southward over time, or should have been moving back and forth over time, and there should be a gap in the Bay of Biscay, and we approximately see that. Oops. So we've taken these kinds of models and expanded them over a larger time period using data from the Ensembles project, which is a European Union project involving the combination of global circulation models and regional circulation models. This project provides 11 different combinations of regional and global models. And so we ran our metapopulation model under the results of each of these separate combinations. And what we have here are the results from 1967, 76, 2006, 2010 for these models. The observations are here. We did it for Diopatra and for Semibalanus. And what we find is for Diopatra, if approximately 70% of the models agree where the geographic limit should be, that's about where you find it. And so the prediction for the future is Diopatra should expand through the English Channel by 2099. For Semibalanus, similar conclusion, about 60% of the models agree we get the correct geographic limit. And the projection is that Semibalanus should retreat northward and be absent from the western tip of France and also from Ireland by 2099. So big regime change in the future. So these models are very strongly based on temperature. What we have found, however, is that there are cases where these models fail completely. So here is an example of one of these models. This one is for Mytilus edulis, where our model of the geographic limit, it says the species should live here, it should be absent down here. The actual geographic limit is there, and that's where the tolerance limit of the species is. When we apply the same model to Europe, the model fails completely. The southern geographic limit of Mytilus edulis is here, but the model says it should live everywhere in Europe, including almost into the Black Sea. So here is a case of a model that fails. This is the basis of our new NASA grant, which says we need to find why models fail. Why a model that works is validated both in space and time for one place fails completely somewhere else. So what we're starting to do is use physiological performance as a way to get at this question. And actually, back up one. What we have this idea that the lethal limit of a species may be here, but the ecological or physiological performance of the species may have its limit here. So physiological performance tends to have a low temperature limit. Then there's an increase in heart rate, reproduction, growth, everything else at intermediate temperatures, and then everything collapses at a higher temperature. But then there's a lethal limit here. Our argument is that if this difference between the lethal limit and the ecological performance limit is large, then models may not transfer well from one location to another. If this difference is very small, then models may transfer very well. So this is the basis of what we are trying to do here, is measure that difference. So we've done some preliminary analyses. This is a measure of the difference between assimilation and respiration for Mytilus species, 3 species. They all have 0 net energy at different temperatures. Galloprovincialis around 28 degrees, Chthamalus around 24 degrees, and Chthamalus around 20 degrees. And that matches pretty well their geographic distribution. If we take a scope for growth model incorporating daily SST and chlorophyll, we end up with this distribution of body size at the end of 1 year after larval settlement. And the end of the continuous distribution of animals that are large is right around here. And that's approximately the right geographic limit. So we think physiology will give us a clue here. So in summary, I've talked about extreme events. I've said they can have lasting effects. They had lasting effects in the 1960s. This leads to great difficulties in interpreting biogeography. If you go today to a place and find the distribution of a species, today's distribution is not only about what's going on today, but it's also about the history of the place. So if you don't know the history, you may get completely the wrong impression of what's going on. So biogeographic distribution is dependent on gradual climate change, as we showed from the historical effects. It's also important, has extreme effects that extreme events like the cold winters can reset geographic boundaries, move them hundreds of kilometers. And then it may take decades for that to return to the previous distribution. Demographic storage matters. If adults can survive, then populations stay in the same place for a long time. Connectivity also matters. We predict that there'll be a regime shift by the late part of this century on the European coast. Our new project uses physiology, hopefully, to inform geographic distribution models in collaboration with the people here, including Gonzalo and Elsa. And I'll stop at that point, and then Sally will talk next.